Chapter 2, the psychological hypostatization of the universal. 7. The metaphysical and psychological hypostatization of the universal. Nominalism. Two misunderstandings have dominated the development of doctrines concerning universal objects. First, the metaphysical hypostatization of the universal, the assumption that the species really exists externally to thought. Secondly, the psychological hypostatization of the universal, the assumption that species really exists in thought. The older nominalism, whether of an extreme or a conceptualistic type, attacked the first misunderstanding, the misunderstanding which underlies Platonic realism, in the sense in which this is traditionally conceived. To combat the second misunderstanding, especially in the form of Locke's abstract ideas, has inspired the development of the modern theory of abstraction since Berkeley's time, and has given it its definite trend towards extreme nominalism, which is now usually called nominalism simpliciter, and opposed to conceptualism. It was thought needful, to avoid the absurdities of Locke's abstract ideas, altogether to reject universal objects as peculiar thought unities, and universal presentations as peculiar acts of thought. Ignoring the difference between universal intuitions on the one hand, among which not only such abstract ideas, but the general images of traditional logic belong, and universal meanings on the other, men rejected conceptual presentations, with their peculiar presentative intentions, if not in word, then at least in the sense of these words, and replaced them by individual presentations merely functioning in an extraordinary manner. Nominalism therefore adds itself, as a third misunderstanding, to our previous two. In various forms it seeks to transform what is universal in object and act of thought, into what is individual. These misunderstandings, insofar as they are still of actual interest, must be gone through in order. It lies in the nature of our subject matter, as our discussions up to this point have made plain, that we cannot separate vexed issues regarding the essence of universal objects from issues regarding the essence of universal presentations. It is vain to seek to make out a persuasive case validating talk about universal objects, if one does not also remove doubts as to how such objects can be presented, and if one does not further refute theories apparently proving, by scientific psychological analysis, that only individual presentations exist, that only individual objects therefore can be, and ever have been brought to consciousness, and that talk about universal objects can only be understood as fictitious or as gravely improper. We may leave aside, as long disposed of, the misunderstandings of Platonic realism. But the thought motives pressing towards a psychologizing realism are obviously still operative, as appears particularly in the manner in which Locke tends to be criticized. We must go deeper into such motives in this chapter. 8. A deceptive line of thought. The following line of thought might be opposed to our conception, not so much out of serious conviction, as in order to give an apagogic proof of the untenability of talk about species as universal objects. If species are nothing reales, and if they are also nothing in thought, then they are nothing at all. How can we talk about something if it does not at least exist in our thought? The being of the ideal is therefore obviously a being in consciousness. The name content of consciousness rightly applies to it. As opposed to this, real being, reale sane, is no mere being in consciousness, or being a content. It is being in itself, transcendent being, being times outside of consciousness. We do not wish to lose ourselves in the erring paths of such a metaphysics. For us what is in consciousness counts as real, just as much as what is outside of it. What is real, is the individual with all its constituents. It is something here and now. For us temporality is a sufficient mark of reality. Real being and temporal being may not be identical notions, but they coincide in extension. We do not, of course, suppose that psychical experiences are in a metaphysical sense things. But even they belong to a thing like unity, if the traditional metaphysical conviction is right in holding that all temporal existence must be things, or must help to constitute things. Should we wish, however, to keep all metaphysics out, we may simply define reality in terms of temporality. For the only point of importance is to oppose it to the timeless being of the ideal. It is further clear that the universal, as often as we speak of it, is a thing thought of by us. It is not therefore a thought content in the sense of a realan, one constituent in our thought experiences, and likewise not a thought content in the sense of an intention, but is rather an object that we think of. Is it not obvious that an object, even when real, and truly existent, cannot be conceived as a real part of the act which thinks it? And isn't even the fictitious and the absurd, whenever we speak of it, something we think of? It is naturally not our intention to put the being of what is ideal on a level with the being thought of which characterizes the fictitious of the nonsensical. The latter does not exist at all, and nothing can properly be predicated of it, if we nonetheless speak of it as having its own, merely intentional mode of being. We see on reflection that this is an improper way of speaking. There are, in fact, merely certain necessary and valid connections among objectless ideas, whose analogy with truths governing ideas having objects, has prompted this talk of objects merely presented which do not genuinely exist. Ideal objects, on the other hand, exist genuinely. Evidently there is not merely a good sense in speaking of such objects, for example of the number 2, the quality of redness, of the principle of contradiction etc., and in conceiving them as sustaining predicates, we also have insight into certain categorical truths that relate to such ideal objects. If these truths hold, everything presupposed as an object by their holding must have being. If I see the truth that 4 is an even number, that the predicate of my assertion actually pertains to the ideal object 4, then this object cannot be a mere fiction, a mere farand a mere nothing in reality. This does not exclude the possibility that the sense of this being, and the sense also of this predication, does not coincide exactly with their sense in cases where a reales, predicate, a property is asserted or denied of a real subject. Otherwise put, we do not deny but in fact emphasize, that there is a fundamental categorical split in our unified conception of being, or what is the same, in our conception of an object as such. We take account of this split when we distinguish between ideal being and real being, between being as species and being as what is individual. The conceptual unity of predication likewise splits into two essentially different subspecies according as we affirm or deny properties of individuals, or affirm or deny general determinations of species. This difference does not, however, do away with the supreme unity in the concept of an object, nor with the correlated concept of a categorical propositional unity. In either case something, a predicate, pertains or does not pertain to an object, a subject, and the sense of this most universal pertinence, together with the laws governing it, also determines the most universal sense of being, or of an object, as such, exactly as the more special sense of generic predication, with its governing laws, determines, or presupposes, the sense of an ideal object. If everything which has being is rightly recognized as having being, and as having such and such a being, in virtue of the evidence with which, in thought, we apprehend it as being, then without doubt we may not reject the self-justifying claims of ideal being. No interpretative skill in the world can in fact eliminate ideal objects from our speech and our thought. 9. Locke's doctrine of abstract ideas. The psychological hypostatization of the universal in Locke's philosophy had, as we saw, an extraordinary historical influence. It grew out of the following line of thought: in actual reality nothing like a universal exists, only individual things, arranged into genera and species by their exact or less exact resemblances, have real existence. If we remain within the sphere of what is immediately given and experienced, in the sphere of ideas in Locke's sense, phenomenal things are complexes of simple ideas, in which the same simple ideas, the same phenomenal attributes, recur simply or in groups. Things now receive names, and not merely proper names, but for the most part common names. The fact that many things can be unambiguously named by one and the same universal name, shows that a universal sense or idea must correspond to such a name. If we consider how the general name applies to the objects of the pertinent class, it becomes plain that it does so because one and the same attribute, or complex of attributes, is common to all these objects. The univocality of the universal name extends only as far as objects are named by way of this and no other attribute, or idea of an attribute. The universal thought carried out in such universal meanings therefore presupposes that we have the power of abstraction, i.e. the power to separate off partial ideas, ideas of such attributes, from the phenomenal things given to us as complexes of attributes, and to associate them with words of which they are the general meanings. The possibility and actuality of such separation is guaranteed by the fact that each universal name has its own meaning, conveys an attributive idea exclusively bound up with itself, as also by the fact that we can at will pick out any attributes and make them the specific meanings of new general names. The formation of abstract or universal ideas, those creations and artifacts of the word, is indeed not without difficulty. They do not so easily offer themselves as we are apt to imagine. For example, does it not require some pains and skill to form the general idea of a triangle, which is yet none of the most abstract, comprehensive and difficult, for it must be neither oblique, nor rectangle, neither equilateral, equiquiral nor scalar, but all and none of these at once. In effect, it is something imperfect, that cannot exist, an idea wherein some parts of several different and inconsistent ideas are put together. It is true, the mind in this imperfect state has need of such ideas, and makes all the haste to them it can, for the conveniency of communication and enlargement of knowledge. But yet one has reason to suspect such ideas are marks of our imperfection. 3. Criticism. In this line of thought several fundamental errors are intertwined. The basic defect of Locke's theory of knowledge, and of the English theory of knowledge in general, its unclear concept of idea, is very plainly revealed in its consequences. We note the following points. 1. An idea is defined as any object of interior perception, whatever the mind perceives in itself, or is the immediate object of perception, thought or understanding, that I call idea. For by ready extension, perception need not actually follow every possible object of interior perception, and finally every content in the immanent psychological sense, is ranged under the rubric of idea. 2. Idea also has for Locke the narrower sense of presentation, in the sense which marks out a very restricted class of experiences, i.e. intentional experiences. Each idea is an idea of something, it presents something. 3. Locke confuses presentation with what is as such presented, appearance with what appears, the act or act phenomenon, as a really immanent element in the stream of consciousness, with the object intended. The apparent object therefore becomes an idea, its attributes partial ideas. 4. The confusion mentioned in 3 is connected with the fact that Locke confounds the attributes pertaining to the object with the immanent contents constituting the sensuous kernel of the presentative act, the sensations on which the interpretative act puts an objective interpretation, or by way of which it putatively perceives, or otherwise envisages, the object's attributes. 5. Under the rubric of general idea, properties as specific attributes, and properties as objective aspects, are confused. 6. It is of great significance, lastly, that Locke altogether fails to distinguish between an idea in the sense of an intuitive presentation, a phenomenon, a floating image, and an idea in the sense of a significant reference. This latter likewise can be interpreted either as meaning intention or as a meaning fulfillment, for these two also are never separated by Locke. These confusions, still rampant in contemporary epistemology, gave Locke's doctrine of abstract general ideas an air of obviousness which could impose on its author. Objects of intuitive presentation, animals, trees etc., conceived as they appear to us, and not as being the patterns of primary qualities and powers which real things are for Locke, these certainly are not the things which appear in our intuitive presentation, cannot be allowed by us to be complexes of ideas, and therefore themselves ideas. They are not objects of possible interior perception, as if they constituted a complex phenomenological content in consciousness, in which they could be picked out as real data. We should not be led astray by the fact that we make an equivocal use of the same words to refer to the sensuously apparent determinations of things, and to the presentative aspects of our percepts, and that we at one time speak of color, smoothness, shape etc., in the sense of objective properties, and at another time in the sense of sensations. An opposition of principle divides the two. Sensations, animated by interpretations, present objective determinations in corresponding percepts of things, but they are not themselves these objective determinations. The apparent object, as it appears in the appearance, transcends this appearance as a phenomenon. We may be led by certain reasons to distinguish apparent determinations into merely apparent and genuine ones, perhaps as in the sense of the traditional distinction between secondary and primary qualities. The subjectivity of the secondary qualities can never amount to the nonsensical assertion that they are real constituents of phenomena. The apparent objects of external intuition are meant unities, not ideas or complexes of ideas in the Lockean sense of these terms. Naming by means of universal names does not, moreover, consist in picking out particular universal ideas from such complexes of ideas, and attaching them to words as their meanings. The naming which, in the true sense of the word, rests on intuition, may direct itself specially to an isolated attribute, but this self-direction is an act of meaning in a sense analogous to the sense in which the self-direction to the concrete object is itself such an act of meaning. This act of meaning means something for itself, which, in the meaning of the concrete object, is, we may say, meant along with something else. But this does not mean that it achieves a separation. We may say generally, what an intention is directed to, is thereby made the intention's peculiar object. But to say that it is made the intention's peculiar object, and to say that it is made an object separated from all other objects, are two totally different assertions. Properties understood as attributive aspects, are plainly inseparable from their concrete basis. Contents of this sort cannot exist independently, but they can nonetheless be independently meant. The intention does not separate, but it refers, and what it refers to, it eo ipso shuts off to the extent that it means this and nothing else. This holds of every sort of meaning, and one must be clear that not every meaning is an intuitive beholding, and not every intuition an adequate beholding of its object, embracing that object perfectly and exhaustively in itself. All this does not suffice to decide our question. The single individual objective aspect is not the attribute in specie. If the former, the aspect, is meant, the meaning is individual in character. If the species is meant, the meaning is specific in character. Naturally again the emphasis which the attributive aspect receives, does not mean a separation of the same. Our meaning, in the latter case, certainly in a fashion directs itself to the apparent aspect, but in an essentially new manner, the intuitive foundation being identical, the act character makes all the difference. Similar differences are observable between the generic idea in the usual sense, for example tree, horse etc., and direct presentations of things or concrete realities in general. Everywhere we must distinguish between simple intuitions, whether total or partial, which form our foundation, and the changing act characters, which, as thoughts, are built on this foundation, without the least change in their sensuous, intuitive basis. For a closer analysis we should here have to start discussing many more distinctions of acts than we need in criticizing Locke. The intuitively singular is on one occasion directly meant as that thing there, on another occasion as sustaining a universal, as subject of an attribute or as individual member of an empirical class. On yet another occasion the universal itself is meant, for example the species of an attribute stressed in a partial intuition, or, yet again, such a species is meant as a subspecies of an ideal genus etc. One and the same sensuous intuition can on occasion serve as a basis for all these modes of conceiving. To these differences of genuine thought, in which manifold categorial forms are actually constituted, correspond the symbolic intentions of our expressions. As merely asserting and meaning, we can say and mean everything which we perhaps do not actualize at all in the genuine, intuitively fulfilled manner. Our thought is then of a merely symbolic, non-authentic sort. Locke cannot do justice to this phenomenological state of things. The sensuous intuitive image, through which the significant intention fulfills itself, is taken by Locke, as said above, sixth confusion, for the meaning itself. Our last assertion confirms and explains our objection. For Locke's identification is inept, whether we understand by a meaning the intending or the fulfilling variety. The former lies in an expression as such, its significant intention constitutes a universal presentation in the sense of a universal meaning, and as such it is possible without any actual intuitive foundation. If fulfillment now enters, our discussions show that the sensuous intuitive image is not the fulfillment of meaning itself, but the mere foundation for this fulfilling act. To the universal thought, merely symbolically realized, i.e. the mere meaning of the universal word, the authentically carried out thought corresponds, which in its turn rests on an act of sensuous intuition, without being identical with the latter. Now we completely see the deceptive confusions in Locke's train of thought. From the obvious truth that each universal name has its own peculiar universal meaning, he passes on to assert that a general idea corresponds to every general name, which idea is for him simply a separate intuitive presentation, a separate appearance, of an attribute. This follows necessarily from the fact that he confuses the word's meaning, whose fulfillment tests this appearance, with the appearance itself. The separated meaning, whether intending or fulfilled, of the attribute, becomes a separated intuition of this attribute. Since Locke fails to hold apart an attribute's appearance from the attribute which appears, confusion 3, and as little holds apart an attributive aspect from an attribute specifically understood, confusion 5, he indeed achieves a psychological hypostatization of the universal in his general idea, he makes of the universal a real datum in consciousness. 5. Locke's universal triangle. These errors avenge themselves in the absurdities into which, in his example of the universal idea of a triangle, they plunge the great thinker. This idea is the idea of a triangle which is neither rectangular nor acute-angled etc. So it readily seems, if one first takes the universal idea of the triangle for the universal meaning of the name, and then replaces the latter in consciousness by the separated intuitive presentation, or by the intuited separate existence of the attributive complex in question. Thus we might have an interior image which is triangular and no more, the generic attributes torn adrift from their specific differences, and turned into a psychic reality. That this conception is not merely false but nonsensical, need scarcely be said. The inseparability of the universal, its incapacity for being made real, holds a priori, it is rooted in the essence of the genus as such. One might perhaps say more impressively, with Locke's example in view, that geometry uses the definition of triangle to prove a priori that every triangle is either acute-angled or obtuse-angled or right-angled, etc. It knows no distinction between triangles in reality and triangles in idea, i.e., triangles floating as pictures before the mind. What is incompatible a priori, is absolutely so, and so also in a picture. The adequate picture of a triangle is itself a triangle. Locke therefore is deceived when he thinks to combine his express recognition of the plain non-existence of a real universal triangle, with its existence in our presentations. He forgets that mental existence is also real existence, and that, when being presented is opposed to being real, one does not and ought not to point to the opposition between the mental and the extra-mental, but to the opposition between what is presented, in the sense of being merely meant, and what is true, in the sense of corresponding to such a meaning. To be meant does not, however, mean to have mental reality. Locke should, above all, have reminded himself that a triangle is something which has triangularity, but that triangularity is not itself something that has triangularity. The universal idea of triangle, as an idea of triangularity, is therefore the idea of what every triangle as such possesses, but it is not therefore itself the idea of a triangle. If one calls the general meaning a concept, the attribute itself the concept's content, and every subject having this attribute the concept's object, one can put the point in the form, it is absurd to treat a concept's content as the same concept's object, or to include a concept's content in its own conceptual extension. 6. One sees further how Locke piles up his absurdities in not only thinking of the universal triangle as a triangle stripped of all specific differences, but also as a triangle, which unites all such differences together, and so puts into the content of the concept of triangle the extension of the subspecies which divide it. This is, however, merely a passing lapse in Locke. It is plain at least that difficulties regarding universal meanings give no ground for serious complaints regarding the imperfections of the human mind. Note, how little the errors of the Lockean doctrine of general ideas have been clarified up to date, is shown among other things by the recent treatment of the doctrine of universal objects, which, following Erdmann, are now accorded a place alongside of individual objects, though not indeed in our sense. Thus Twardowski thinks that, what is presented in the universal idea is an object 7 specifically peculiar to it, and that this is a group of constituents which several objects have in common. 8. The object of the universal idea is a part of the object of an idea subordinated to it, which stands in relation of exact likeness to definite parts of the objects of other individual ideas. The general idea is to this extent spurious that it is held by many to be incapable of an actual carrying out. But that there nevertheless are such ideas, must be granted by the man who sees that we can say something about their objects. This we plainly can do. No one can represent a universal triangle intuitively, a triangle neither right-angled, nor obtuse-angled nor acute-angled, which is without color or definite size, but it is as plain that we have an indirect idea of such triangles as that we have indirect ideas of a female stallion 9 or of a steel cannon made of wood etc. We read further that Plato's ideas are no more than objects of universal ideas. Plato attributes existence to these objects. This we no longer do. The object of the universal idea is represented by us, but does not exist. 10. Here it is clear that Locke's absurdities are with us again. We certainly have an indirect presentation of a universal triangle, for this merely refers to the meaning of that nonsensical expression. But one would not grant that the universal presentation of the triangle is this indirect presentation of a universal triangle, or that it is the presentation of the triangle concealed in all triangles, but without being acute-angled, obtuse-angled etc. Twardowski is consistent in rejecting the existence of universal objects. He is right in so regarding the absurd objects he has substituted for them. But what is the case in regard to such existential propositions as there are concepts, there are propositions, there are algebraic numbers etc.? For Twardowski as for us, existence does not mean the same as real existence. It is also hard to understand how the universal object, which is supposed to be a constituent of the subsumed concrete object, should lack intuitive givenness, and should not rather share in the intuitive quality of this concrete object. If a total content is intuited, all its single traits are intuited together with, and in it, and many are independently noted, set in relief, and so made objects of their own proper intuitions. May we no longer say that we see the tree's green coloring in the tree precisely as we see the green tree. The notion of green can indeed not be seen, whether this be the notion in the sense of the meaning of green, or the notion in the sense of the attribute green, the species gr. But it is also absurd to treat concept as a part of the individual object, the object of the concept. The doctrine of generic images. The above discussions have made clear without further analysis that the other WC1y of hypostatizing the universal, which has played its part in traditional logic under the rubric of generic images, is infected with the same absurdities as Locke's notion and has grown out of similar confusions. The vagueness and elusiveness of generic images in respect of specific differences makes no difference to their concreteness. Vagueness is a definite feature of certain contents, it consists in a certain mode of continuity in qualitative transition. And as to elusiveness, it makes no difference to the concreteness of each rapidly changing content. The essence of the matter does not reside in changing contents, but in the unity of an intention directed to constant attributes.